Black Hills, South Dakota, October 1897. The air, already sharp with the promise of winter, carried the scent of pine sap and the rhythmic thud of Konrad Zurbuchen's mallet against oak pegs. But it was not the sound that drew the eyes of his neighbors, nor the scent. It was the sight. Below the ridge where most men built, a narrow, stone-choked gorge cut through the land, a 20-foot deep scar left by some forgotten glacial melt. It was a useless piece of ground, a place to dump fieldstone and forget. And it was over this void that Konrad Zurbuchen was building his home. From either side of the chasm, massive foundation piers of granite rose, painstakingly mortared. Resting on them were the two largest timbers the local mill had ever cut, a pair of 30-foot yellow pines, squared to a perfect 18 inches. They didn't just span the gap, they cantilevered out from the piers, seeming to hang in the empty air with a stubborn, unnatural defiance. Prewitt Hance, the mill foreman, stood with a group of men, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. He had sold Zurbuchen the timbers, but now he felt a kind of proprietary regret, as if his good pine was being squandered on a monument to foolishness. "He's building a bridge to nowhere," Hance declared, his voice carrying easily on the thin air. "Come the first deep freeze, that whole frame's going to twist. Those piers will heave different, one in the sun, one in the shade. It'll tear itself apart by January." A younger farmer, Jedediah Morse, squinted. "What's he think he's doing anyway? Wasting all that space underneath?" "He's Swiss," Hance said, as if that explained everything. "They build funny in the mountains. This isn't the mountains. This is the prairie, and the prairie ground has teeth." He turned to the man next to him. "Mark my words, that man's either crazy or a fool. Probably both." Zurbuchen heard them. He had to, but he never turned. He simply sighted down the length of a cross joist, made a small pencil mark, and set his saw to the wood. The rasp of the steel blade was his only reply. The men watched for another minute, shook their heads and walked away, their judgment rendered. The mockery would last the rest of the autumn. The validation would have to wait for the cold. What did this quiet Swiss carpenter, a man who had spent his life framing buildings against alpine avalanches, understand about the brutal rising cold of the prairie earth that a man who had milled 1,000,000 board feet of Dakota pine had missed? The answer would change how people survived on the high plains. But to understand his strange solution, you first have to understand the problem he was trying to solve, a problem most of his neighbors didn't even know they had. If you stay with me, I promise you'll learn a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that is as true today as it was in 1897. It's the secret of why your basement is cold, and how one man defeated that cold by floating his house in the air. Let us know in the comments what you think the biggest source of heat loss in a home is. The walls, the roof, or the floor? The answer might surprise you. Konrad Zurbuchen was not a frontiersman. He was not a farmer, a rancher, or a prospector. He was a specialist, an artisan whose skills were honed in a world of verticality and immense pressure. He was an Alpiner Zimmermann, a master carpenter from the Bernese Oberland of Switzerland. His hands knew the language of timber under duress, how to build a chalet frame that could bear the weight of 20 feet of snow, how to cantilever a balcony over a 1,000-foot drop, how to join wood so tightly it became a single, monolithic structure. He understood that the greatest enemies were often the unseen ones, the slow, grinding pressure of a glacier, the subtle expansion of freezing water in a microscopic crack, and the silent, relentless theft of heat by a mass of frozen earth. He had come to America with his wife, Annalise, and their two small children, Emile and Lenny, seeking land and opportunity. He found it in the Black Hills, a place whose ruggedness felt distantly familiar. But the familiarity was a lie. The cold here was different. It was not the clean, crisp cold of the high Alps, buffered by a thick blanket of insulating snow. It was a vicious, wind-driven, ground-up cold. Their first winter, in 1896, was a lesson in this new enemy. They lived in a standard homesteader's cabin built quickly and tightly, with chinked logs and a stone fireplace. By all local standards, it was a good, solid cabin, but it was a sieve for warmth. The problem wasn't the walls, which he had sealed meticulously. It wasn't the roof, which he had planked and sodded in the traditional style. The problem was the floor. The cabin was built on a shallow stone foundation directly on the ground. As the Dakota winter set in, the earth froze solid, 5, then 6 feet down. The frozen soil became a single, massive, cold-conducting block. The cabin's floor, simple pine planks laid over log joists, was in direct contact with this block via the foundation. The warmth from their fire didn't just radiate into the room. It was wicked, straight down, into the heat-hungry maw of the frozen continent. Annalise would spend hours trying to keep the fire roaring, feeding it precious, hard-won timber, only to feel a constant chilling draft at her ankles. The floor was the coldest part of the house, colder even than the air outside at times. In the mornings, a rime of frost would cover the floorboards near the walls. The children, Emile and Lenny, could never play on the floor. They lived on the benches and the bed, bundled in wool. One morning, a sharp crack echoed through the cabin. A floorboard near the hearth, subjected to the brutal temperature differential, had split clean in two. By February, their neighbors, the Schmidts, had 3 split planks and a mainsail log that had heaved up a full inch, jamming their door shut. Starting the morning fire wasn't a comfort. It was a desperate, hour-long battle to raise the cabin's temperature from near freezing to merely miserable. Konrad realized they weren't just heating a small box of air. They were trying to heat the entire state of South Dakota. That winter, he didn't see a construction problem. He saw a physics problem. He was losing a war of conduction. The earth itself was his enemy, and it had a direct, unimpeded path into his home. While his neighbors cursed the wind and bought bigger stoves, Konrad Zurbuchen spent the cold nights sketching on scraps of wood, remembering the principles he had learned building barns in the high alpine meadows. Barns that kept livestock from freezing by decoupling them from the frozen ground. He was not going to fight the earth again. He was going to disconnect from it completely. The conventional failure of frontier cabins in the high plains was a tragedy of misplaced focus. A settler's entire attention was on what he could see and feel. The wind, the snow, the drafts through the walls. A well-built cabin in Dakota was defined by tight log work, good chinking between the logs, and a solid roof. The floor was an afterthought. It was simply the surface you walked on. A man laid heavy joists on a stone or log foundation, pegged thick planks to them, and called it done. The foundation's only job was to keep the cabin level and the sill logs from rotting. But this design contained a fatal flaw, one rooted in the physics of heat transfer. Heat moves in 3 ways: radiation, convection, and conduction. Radiation is the warmth you feel from a fire across a room. Convection is the movement of heat through air, like the hot air rising from a stove. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact, and it is by far the most ruthless. The ground beneath the Black Hills in winter becomes what physicists call a heat sink. At a stable temperature of -20 degrees Fahrenheit or -30 degrees Fahrenheit, the immense thermal mass of the Earth has a virtually infinite capacity to absorb heat. Placing a warm cabin on top of this frozen mass is like placing a hot coffee mug on a block of ice the size of a mountain. The mug will lose. The standard cabin foundation provided a perfect thermal bridge. The cabin's sill logs, warmed by the interior air and the fireplace, sat directly on the foundation stones. Those stones sat directly on the frozen soil. Heat flowed from the wood to the stone to the ground, a constant, unstoppable river of precious BTUS flowing into the void. The floorboards, just inches above this thermal battleground, were constantly losing their heat to the ground below. The air in the shallow crawl space, if one existed at all, was not still. It was a swirling vortex of convection, with cold air from the outside infiltrating through gaps and chilling the underside of the floor. The results were measurable and miserable. A thermometer placed on the floor of a neighbor's cabin might read 38 degrees Fahrenheit, while the air at eye level was 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This 22-degree stratification meant that the inhabitants lived in two different climates simultaneously. Their heads were comfortable, while their feet were slowly freezing. It also created a constant convective loop in the cabin, as the cold, dense air from the floor spilled across the room, displacing the warm air from the stove upwards, where it was often lost through the chimney. Families burned through cords of wood at a shocking rate, not to stay warm, but to stay alive. Furthermore, the ground itself fought back. As moisture in the soil froze, it expanded, creating frost heave. A foundation laid on soil that was not uniformly drained or shaded would heave unevenly. One corner of a cabin might rise an inch while the other stayed put. This differential movement placed enormous stress on the rigid log structure. Doors would jam, windows would crack, and floorboards would buckle and split. Prewitt-Hance was right about one thing. The prairie ground had teeth, and it chewed on the foundations of every building in the territory. The common wisdom was to build stronger, with bigger logs and deeper foundations. The solution was seen as a matter of brute force. Konrad Zurbuchen saw it as a matter of finesse. You don't win a war with the earth by fighting it. You win by refusing to let it touch you. The construction of the Gorge cabin began in late summer. Konrad chose his spot not for the view or for its proximity to water, but for the gorge itself. He spent a week with a plumb bob and line, measuring its depth and charting the bedrock on either side. Then, with the help of a hired team of oxen, he began hauling granite fieldstone. He didn't lay a traditional foundation trench. Instead, he excavated two massive, precise squares, one on each lip of the gorge, 30 feet apart. He went down 6 feet until he hit the solid, unmoving bedrock that lay beneath the topsoil. On this bedrock, he began to build his piers. He was not a mason, but he worked with the patient precision of one, selecting stones that fit together like puzzle pieces, filling every gap with a lime and sand mortar he mixed himself. The communities watched this slow, strange work with growing amusement. Building his own castle towers, one man joked at the general store. Hance, stopping by to check on the progress, was less amused. "You're wasting good mortar, Zurbuchen. A dry stack foundation is good enough for anyone." "Good enough is not the same as right," Konrad replied, not looking up from his trowel. By September, the two piers were finished, 4-foot square columns of solid stone rising 8 feet above the ground. They were monoliths, anchored to the very bones of the earth. Now came the timbers. Hance had been reluctant to sell them. 30-footers? 18-inch square? What in God's name for? You building a railroad trestle? "A foundation," Konrad had said simply. Getting the two main beams into place was an engineering feat. Using a system of levers, log rollers, and the straining oxen, Konrad and a single hired hand inched the multi-ton beams across the gorge, cantilevering them out from the piers until they met in the middle. He didn't have them touch. He left a 6-inch gap, which he would later span with the floor joists. The main structure was two independent cantilevered arms, each anchored to its pier with enormous hand-cut mortise and tenon joints, locked in place with massive oak pegs he had whittled himself. It was at this stage that Prewitt-Hance made his final visit. He walked around the structure, kicking at the piers, sighting down the beams. His face, usually ruddy with confidence, was a mask of professional skepticism. Zurbuchen, I'm telling you, as the man who milled this wood, this is a mistake. This is fine timber, and you're going to ruin it. Konrad was fitting a cross joist, his movements economical and precise. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "The ground will freeze," Hans said, pointing a thick finger downward. "That north pier is going to catch the frost deeper than the south one. It's going to heave a half-inch, maybe more. This beam," he slapped the enormous timber, "is going to lift. The other one won't. Your whole frame is going to twist right here in the middle. It'll shear your pegs, split your joists, and wreck your floor. It's a terrible design for this climate." His voice hardened. "I can't in good conscience extend you any more credit for the planking and siding. I won't be party to it." Konrad looked at Hans. He looked at the north pier, then the south. He looked down into the gorge, at the still, cool air hanging in the shadows. He nodded slowly. "I understand your position, Mr. Hans." Then he turned back to his work, picked up his mallet, and drove another peg home. The sound was solid, final. Anneliese watched from a distance, her hands twisting in her apron. Later that evening, as they ate by the fire of their temporary shelter, she touched his arm. "Konrad, Mr. Hans, he is an expert. He says the house will twist." Konrad finished his bread, wiped his mouth, and looked at her. His face was calm, tired but certain. "In Switzerland, we build for the snow, which presses down. Here, I build for the ground, which pushes up. The forces are different, so the house must be different. The house will not twist, Anneliese. It will float." The physics behind Konrad's strange cabin was both simple and profound. He had neutralized the primary weapon of the Dakota winter, conduction, by creating an enormous buffer of the world's best and cheapest insulator, still air. To understand the genius of this, one must think in terms of British thermal units, or BTUs. A BTU is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. Every piece of wood burned in Konrad's stove released a finite number of BTUs. In a conventional cabin, a huge percentage of those BTUs were immediately conducted through the floor and into the frozen ground. Compacted frozen earth, with its moisture content locked into ice crystals, is a remarkably effective conductor of heat. Its R value, a measure of thermal resistance, is abysmal, less than 1 per foot of depth. Air, on the other hand, is a terrible conductor. Its molecules are spread far apart, making it difficult for thermal energy to pass from one to the next. The R value of a 1-inch pocket of still air is about 1. The key word is still. If air is allowed to move, it creates convection currents that carry heat away. This is why a windy day feels so much colder. The gorge beneath Konrad's cabin was the perfect trap for still air. It was 20 feet deep and relatively narrow. Once the winter settled in and the temperature stratified, the air in that gorge would become almost completely stationary. The coldest, densest air would sink to the bottom, and it would stay there. There were no winds to disturb it. The cabin floor, acting as a roof for the gorge, would protect it from the elements. He had, in effect, created a 20-foot thick cushion of insulation beneath his entire home. The cabin floor was no longer in a conductive relationship with the ground. For heat to escape through the floor, it would first have to radiate across the air gap. Then it would have to be conducted through 20 feet of still, poorly conducting air molecules. Finally, it would have to be absorbed by the frozen rock at the bottom of the gorge. The path of least resistance was gone. He had severed the thermal bridge. A BTU generated by his stove now had a much higher chance of staying inside the living space, warming the air his family breathed, rather than leaking into the earth. And what of Hans's objection? The frost heave? Konrad had solved that too. His piers were not built on the soil. They were built through it. anchored directly to the bedrock. The bedrock of the Black Hills does not heave. It is the stable, immovable foundation of the land itself. The soil around the piers could freeze, expand, and move all it wanted. It would have no purchase on the solid stone columns. They were like the legs of an oil rig, passing through the turbulent surface to find purchase on the solid sea floor. Both piers were equally stable, equally unmoving. Therefore, the frame they supported could not twist. Konrad Zurbuchen hadn't just built a cabin, he had built a system. It was a thermal machine designed to interact with the forces of the prairie winter in a completely new way. He wasn't fighting the cold with more wood and bigger fires. He was outsmarting it with a deep understanding of its own nature. The problem wasn't the cold falling from the sky. The problem was the cold rising from the earth. That winter arrived with a particular fury. November was cold, but December brought the real test. A mass of Arctic air descended on the high plains and refused to leave. For 22 consecutive days in January of 1898, the temperature in the Black Hills never rose, above -18 degrees Fahrenheit, and crucially, there was no snow. The bare, dark earth was exposed directly to the punishing cold and the relentless wind. The ground froze deeper and harder than anyone could remember. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a period of profound misery. The Schmidt family, whose door had jammed the previous winter, now had a bigger problem. The frost heave was so severe it lifted the northeast corner of their cabin by nearly 2 inches, cracking 2 windows and opening a visible gap between the floor and the wall. They stuffed it with rags and blankets, but the cold poured in. They were burning wood around the clock, the stove glowing a dull red, yet they lived their lives in heavy coats and mittens. At the O'Connell place, a newer cabin built with pride and tight joinery, the floorboards began to shrink and split in the bone-dry, stove-blasted air. Gaps opened up between them, creating dozens of tiny, vicious drafts that chilled the room. Mrs. O'Connell spent her days on her hands and knees trying to plug the gaps with a mixture of flour and water, a temporary paste that would freeze solid and fall out within a day. Their woodpile, which they thought would last till March, was half gone by the end of January. The news from the Zurbuchen place was silence. They didn't visit town for supplies. No one saw smoke constantly billowing from their chimney. The assumption among the men at Hance's mill was that they were either frozen solid or had burned through all their wood and were suffering in silence. But inside the cabin suspended over the gorge, a different reality was unfolding. The first few days of the deep freeze, Konrad was vigilant, constantly checking the joints, the floor, the feel of the air. He kept a small, steady fire in the stove, far smaller than his neighbors. The cabin held the heat. The temperature stratification was minimal. The air at ankle level was only a few degrees cooler than the air at head height. The floor. The floor was the miracle. It was not warm, not like the hearthstone. But it was not cold. It felt neutral, like a piece of wood inside a protected barn. It did not suck the heat out of your feet. After a week, confident in his design, Konrad allowed a quiet normalcy to settle over his family. Lenny and Emil, for the first time in their lives in Dakota, were allowed to play on the floor. Annalise spread a blanket, and the children sat with their wooden toys, their laughter echoing in the warm, still air. The domestic warmth technique was proven in a simple, mundane act. One afternoon, Annalise was making bread. She found the smoothest, cleanest section of the pine floor, dusted it with flour, and began to knead the dough directly on the planks. In any other cabin, the cold from the wood would have instantly killed the yeast and turned the dough into a leaden lump. Here, the dough remained pliable and alive. The floor was just a floor, a stable surface. Its temperature divorced from the brutal cold that held the world in its grip just 20 feet below. They were living not in a shelter against the winter, but in a space entirely separate from it. The freeze broke in early February, but the winter held on until late March. As the thaw began, the ground turned into a muddy, unstable mess. This was the time of reckoning for foundations. It was now, during the freeze-thaw cycles, that the ground would shift and settle, revealing the damage done during the deep cold. Prewitt Hans had heard the rumors that the Zurbuchens were fine, but he didn't believe it. It wasn't possible. His professional certainty, built on 2 decades of experience, told him that the cantilevered frame must have sustained damage. He imagined twisted beams, shattered pegs, a floor buckled like a washboard. Driven by a need to see the failure for himself, he saddled his horse and rode out to the gorge one Saturday afternoon. He brought a 4-foot spirit level with him. He found Konrad outside, splitting wood for the following year. The pile was surprisingly large. Konrad saw him coming and nodded, leaning his axe against the chopping block. He said nothing. "Zurbuchen," Hans began, his tone gruff, "came to see the damage." "There is no damage," Konrad said quietly. "We'll see about that." Hans brushed past him and walked to the cabin. He started with the piers, crouching down to inspect the mortar lines. They were perfect. No cracks, no spalling. He ran his hand along the massive cantilevered beams where they met the stone. The joints were as tight as the day they were cut. He walked under the structure, peering up at the joists. He expected to see splintered wood, signs of torsional stress. He saw nothing but clean, stable timber. Slightly unnerved, he climbed the steps to the cabin door. Anneliese opened it, her face calm. Hans stepped inside. The first thing that hit him was the air. It was warm. Not hot like an overheated stove room, but evenly, pleasantly warm. There was no draft at his ankles. His eyes went straight to the floor. He had seen a dozen floors that week, in cabins he had supplied the timber for. They were all warped, split, and gapped. He walked the length of the Zurbuchen cabin, his heavy boots making a solid, reassuring sound. The planks were flat and tight. The seams were almost invisible. He stopped in the middle of the room and unstrapped the level from his back. He placed it on the floor, perpendicular to the joists. Konrad and Anneliese watched in silence. Hans bent down, his eyes close to the glass vial. He expected to see the bubble skewed, a testament to the twisting he knew must have happened. The bubble was perfectly, exactly, flawlessly centered. He slid the level a few feet over and placed it again. Centered. He turned it 90 degrees, aligning it with the main joists. Centered. It was impossible. A floor that had survived a Dakota winter without snow cover could not be this level. It defied everything he knew. He stood up slowly, his face drained of its usual confident color. He looked from the floor to Konrad's calm, waiting face. The gap between what he had expected to find, the catastrophic failure his experience predicted, and the quiet perfection he was witnessing was too vast to cross with simple words. He had come expecting to see a ruin. He was standing in a masterpiece of engineering. He ran his calloused palm over the smooth, seamless planks. He had expected to feel the splintered edges of heaved boards, the chill of a floor losing its battle with the earth. Instead, he felt only the faint, neutral warmth of stable wood in a comfortable room. The physical sensation was the final, undeniable proof. Hans looked at Konrad, and for the first time, he saw not a foolish immigrant, but a master of a craft he had never imagined. He shook his head, a slow gesture of awe and surrender. "My God, Zurbuchen," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You didn't build a foundation on the earth. You built a shield against it." Prewitt Hans's conversion was as total as his skepticism had been loud. he became Konrad Zurbuchen's most fervent advocate. As the mill foreman, he was in a unique position of influence. When settlers came to him in the spring to buy lumber to repair their damaged cabins, he would listen to their tales of woe, the split floors, the heaved foundations, the insatiable stoves, and then he would tell them about the Swiss carpenter. "You're fighting the wrong enemy," he'd say, leaning over his tally book. "You're chinking your walls when the cold is coming up through your boots. You need to see what Zurbuchen built." He did more than talk. He wrote a long, detailed letter to the Plains Timber and Millwork Quarterly, a trade newsletter read by builders and mill operators across the Dakotas and Nebraska. In it, he described the cantilevered design, the bedrock piers, and the principle of the dead air buffer in the gorge. He confessed his own initial mockery and detailed his inspection, complete with the spirit level test. He called it the Zurbuchen Bridge Foundation and argued it was the only sane way to build on the high plains. The story was compelling, a classic frontier tale of ingenuity. It was picked up and reprinted, with some embellishments, by two regional newspapers, the Dakota Pioneer and the Black Hills Weekly. Suddenly, Konrad Zurbuchen, the quiet Swiss eccentric, was a local celebrity. The true validation, however, came not in print, but in practice. That summer, 3 families who were building new homesteads sought Konrad out. He shared his knowledge freely, without arrogance or any demand for payment. He didn't have a patent or a secret formula. He had a principle, and he explained it with simple clarity, often sketching in the dirt with a stick. "The earth is a thief," he would tell them. "You must not let it touch your house." Not every location had a perfect gorge, but the principle was adaptable. One farmer, building on flat land, used the idea to construct a cabin on tall, bedrock-anchored piers, creating a 4-foot-high dead air space underneath that he enclosed with lattice work to keep the wind from disturbing the air. Another dug a wide, deep trench and built his cabin over it. By the winter of 1898, there were 4 bridge cabins in the territory. The reports that came back the following spring were unanimous. They had burned less than half the wood of their neighbors and had suffered no structural damage from frost heave. The idea worked. The spread had begun. The quiet revolution that Konrad Zurbuchen started in the Black Hills was a perfect example of how a principle, once understood, can be more powerful than a specific design. His gorge cabin was a brilliant solution to a local problem, but the underlying concept, decoupling a structure from the thermal mass of the ground, was universal. He had, with hand tools and alpine intuition, stumbled upon a core tenet of modern building science, a full half-century before it would be formalized with concepts like insulated slab foundations and ventilated crawl spaces. Today, no competent architect would design a home in a cold climate without extensive insulation under the foundation. We use rigid foam board, vapor barriers, and complex drainage systems to achieve what Konrad achieved with a chasm and a column of still air. The enemy he identified, conductive heat loss into the ground, is now understood to be a primary driver of energy inefficiency in buildings worldwide. His solution was elegant because it used the landscape itself as the primary building material. The empty space of the gorge was as important as the timbers that spanned it. He didn't just build a house, he edited the landscape to create the thermal conditions he needed. This foresight, this ability to see the unseen forces at play, is the hallmark of true mastery. While his neighbors saw a useless ditch, Konrad saw an insulator. While they saw the ground as a solid, dependable friend, he saw it as a relentless, energy-draining adversary. His work serves as a reminder that the most powerful innovations often come from looking at a familiar problem from a completely new angle, an angle often provided by an outsider's perspective. In the end, the story of Konrad Zurbuchen's Gorge cabin is a testament to a simple, powerful idea. We spend so much of our lives worried about the obvious threats, the howling wind, the visible storm, the enemy at the gate. We build our walls high and our roofs strong, facing the dangers that announce themselves with noise and fury. We fight the cold that falls from the sky. But Konrad's genius was to recognize that an equally relentless, though silent threat comes from below. The cold rises from the ground as surely as it falls from the sky. The solid earth we stand on, the very symbol of stability and support, is also a vast and patient thief, constantly seeking to steal the warmth that keeps us alive. His cantilevered cabin, hanging suspended in the Dakota air, was more than a clever piece of engineering. It was a philosophical statement. It was a declaration of independence from the ground itself. It taught a vital lesson that echoed down through the generations of builders who followed. If you want to stay truly warm, you must leave the earth no path. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and thermal physics interesting, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. It helps us to continue telling these stories of forgotten ingenuity. And don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on where most of the heat is lost in your own home. We read everyone. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.